All right.
We can
Should
start. We get started, team? All right. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Hi. My name is Lindsay Davis. I am the co-founder of the Femtech Association of Asia, which is all about connecting women's health and technology. So anything from period tracking to hormonal health and everything else that has to do with women's health, such as mental health, which we'll be talking about today. Thank you guys all for coming. It's so nice to have such a nice crowd and obviously really engaged in the topic. And also it's especially exciting to be here when it's a book launch of so many years of hard work put into what look like pages, but is probably a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, and everything in between. So it's really great to have you all here. And I'm sure a lot of you know Natalia. I've heard her speak before, have seen her on LinkedIn. We met a couple months ago, so that's been really fun to just watch. I feel like I get really lucky to meet you right when you're doing all the amazing launches, so I feel kind of spoiled by that. So Natalia, I'm going to read this part only because obviously I don't want to mess up any bios, but Natalia is a keynote speaker, as we'll see today, a writer, a therapist on trauma and transformation, a consultant, an advisor, a founder, a peacemaker, which I think we need in the world right now, and the author of what we're discussing today, Why Am I Like This? Natalia shares her voice to begin to remedy the world's state of hustle, trauma, disconnect, and disrespect, and her insights into the human condition and our profound need for healing, self-compassion, empathy, and human connection definitely inspire audiences. And actually just sitting here for 2 minutes before, I already felt like we do need more empathy in the world. We do need more kindness towards each other. So I think the fact that you're helping take those movements towards self-care with your knowledge and your years of experience, it's incredible. She's a recipient of the 2022 Women Icon Asia Awards for Emerging Entrepreneurs, and continues to break stigmas, which we obviously have in common with Femtech and being able to talk openly about women's health and mental health, as well as empowering people. So I guess to start, just congratulations on your book. It's really exciting, very exciting.
Thank you.
And I just think it's amazing to see all your professional research being put into something that the general public can consume and digest and understand and hopefully help improve our way of thinking and our way of acting. So I would love, I guess, to start, even before the book, I'd love to just hear about you. Where are you from? What's your professional background? And how did you end up sitting on a stage at 1880? Thank you for hosting us, 1880.
Thank you.
How did we end up here with you today?
Thanks for doing this with me, by the way.
It's my pleasure. I love it. It's my pleasure.
I love it too. It's a massive journey that's brought me here today to this room at 1880 and to write this book. I grew up in a lot of trauma. I grew up experiencing physical abuse and emotional abuse and knowing something wasn't right with my world. But back then, of course, it was just normal. So I lived my life as this amalgamation of survival and adaptive responses. And at some point, I couldn't keep it up anymore. And so I have a very complex journey, which you'll have to read the book to learn more about. But at 17, I was misdiagnosed with a mental health condition. At 21, my physical symptoms started to onset, and I actually got stuck in the medical system for 11 years. And at the depth of my illness, I was on 42 medications a day. Wow. I was having 3 intravenous treatments per month. And I was pretty weak and lifeless, and that was just my life, my reality. And I looked everywhere to heal, everywhere. And sometimes I'd find things that would help me cope for a while or feel a little better, but I never really healed. And so the traumas began to decontextualize in more and more diffuse and difficult ways to decipher. And it wasn't until I started to look through the lens of trauma and all that entails that I began to heal. And so I had what doctors would describe as a miracle recovery, but it wasn't a miracle. I just figured out how to heal my trauma and create a life where I could exist and thrive and relate well. And so shortly after I got better, there was a line of people waiting to see me. How did you do that? How did you get better? Can you help me? So I thought, well, I think I can, but I better study. So I studied many different things all around the world, and I began to work with the whole human, with the mind, with the body, with relational dynamics. And there was a really long line to see me. And so I thought, I need to do more than this. So I joined forces with another health professional here, and we created a group of health clinics, and we specifically helped people that had these strange, complex symptoms or experiences that were not resolving with mainstream intervention. And so that was really eye-opening few years as a clinic administrator and figuring out how to help people with trauma when at that time we couldn't even use the word trauma, it was a dirty word. And I guess fast forward to the pandemic, and the whole world is talking about trauma. We've been living through a global trauma. And so I started getting phone calls saying, Natalia, can you come and speak about mental health, burnout, belonging, all of these things. And that is when I got the courage to say, actually, it's time, the world is ready for us to talk about trauma. And so I started Illuma Health, and I also started writing this book. And
simultaneously.
Yes.
A lot of things.
Always.
Lot of things. So when we talk about trauma, can you just expand on that word a little bit? Like what exactly kind of does that, what does trauma mean exactly? Because obviously it sounds very severe, but I imagine in every case trauma is not necessarily severe or noted as severe to the individual.
Trauma is when a past experience of threat is living and breathing in us now, and it can affect us mentally, emotionally, physically, and also relationally. It's largely unconscious and non-verbal, so it's felt, and it presents as sensations, emotions, and relating patterns, and it travels through relationships, families, cultures, and communities. And what you said is really interesting. A lot of people think, oh, trauma is this big, huge thing, but it doesn't have to be. So trauma is not a past event itself. It's the way it is left unmetabolized inside us and the way it decontextualizes through our complex self and through the world around us. So the extent to which we are traumatized will actually depend on our capacity and our resources, both inside us and around us. It's not about the event itself.
That's really interesting. So I think, so does everyone have trauma? I guess would be the other question.
You know, so many people would answer this differently. I wouldn't say that everyone has trauma, but we are all affected by trauma. So we are dynamic relational creatures. So even if we are not holding our own unresolved trauma, we are interacting with someone who does have unresolved trauma. And whether they are, you know, there are different stages of the healing journey, but trauma is a human experience and we are all involved in it together.
And that was one thing, kind of building on that makes a lot of sense, that because we are community and we all are interlinked. So one thing that I was thinking about before our talk and shared a bit, you know, I know before to not surprise you with too many questions, but there seems to be kind of a reflection in your book about like a personal or individual take on trauma, and then that community or external trauma, which you just talked about. Like, how did the world end up this way? How are we sitting here now? Which I'm sure a lot of us have asked based on, you know, no matter where we're from. In my case, you know, originally from the US, and I just think, how did it end up here? You know, it feels very traumatic to me to be, you know, in the state of the US is in. So when I think about that, can you share a little bit about that internal and external influences, how it impacts individuals, communities? Like when you talk about relational, can you just talk a little bit more about what that means with trauma and how it, you know, I know post-traumatic stress disorder can be carried down generations. Would that be an example of that, for instance?
Absolutely.
That's a lot, sorry. So basically external and internal is my question.
Yeah, well, it's a really complex conversation, and something I'm really passionate about is trying to bring these really complex concepts into words that are digestible so we can all really understand what's going on inside us and around us. So we are, the way we are and who we are is a series of either responses or reactions to external stimulus, both from the past and the present. Our blueprint for self is largely formed by the dynamics and experiences in our early life. So our greatest influences are our mother, our father, and our family, but we are also largely influenced by our community, our culture, our religion, and also the context of the world that we live in. And so all of these things come together to create who we are, and we bring all of this into who we are now in the present. Because we are essentially relational, dynamic, and evolutionary, we will continue to change and either evolve or adapt based on dynamics in the present as well. Now, because we do live in a really traumatized world, and it has been that way for some generations, we are holding on to generations of perceptions, bias, ways of existing and relating that actually are harmful, that don't support ourselves or each other. So all of that comes together to who we are now. When we look at our generation, the truth is that most of us have grown up without access to 3 key ingredients that we need in order to thrive in this world. And those are safety, belonging, to feel like we're welcome, and also the ability to express and share authentically without judgment or shame or exclusion or harm. And when we don't have those things, the self that we develop is a reaction to that. And it makes it really hard for us to show up in the world in ways that are peaceful, powerful, sustainable, and collaborative. And so if that is the foundation for who we are, knowing that we are relational creatures, that is what we're going to put into the world. We're co-creating in every moment. So right now, all of us are a community for this hour that we're here together. We're a community. This is a mini world in this room. And we are all both being influenced and we are influencing each other. Our nervous systems are talking to each other and they're picking up thousands of tiny pieces of data and they're bringing them through our nervous system to our brain for integrated and largely unconscious processing. And once that happens, with all of that unconscious material from the past, that then decides and dictates how we perceive, how we express and relate. So we can't explore self without context. We're dynamic. I hope that answers.
It does. It also frightens me that I'm influencing everyone in this room.
You're also being influenced.
I'm in your brains. No, that's super interesting. And what about trauma and oppression? You use those 2 words together in the book. How does that relate?
Oppression is a fundamental experience of trauma. I believe in essence they're one and the same. And the reason I bring them together is because trauma is still for many a really overwhelming word. I don't have trauma. Nope, that's not a conversation I need to be part of. But when we say the word oppression, more people can relate to that. I mean, you talked about the States, right? There's so much oppression happening there. So when we are oppressed, we do not have access to agency and choice. And that is the fundamental experience of someone who has unresolved trauma. We can't get out of it, we can't heal. And healing asks us to create the conditions and dynamics where agency and choice are possible.
Wow, okay, that is definitely a lot. And you mentioned that around, kind of your 17 to early 20s perhaps is where there was a lot of the physical ailments with medical intervention. Is there a typical age when people start noting this trauma as they get older and realizing that maybe that wasn't normal in my childhood, or maybe, I shouldn't say normal, that's not fair, but maybe that wasn't the right experience for me to have gone through, and maybe that was trauma? Is there a certain age group where people start identifying the trauma in their own lives, or could it manifest at any time into very varying degrees of harm?
I think it depends more on the circumstances and the availability of resource and capacity inside and around us. So most of us will suppress our trauma so that we can create a version of ourselves that can go on surviving and coping and trying to belong and do well in this world. There will usually be a point where we can no longer do that because we're not meant to survive forever. And it can happen in one of 2 ways, actually. So either we reach our threshold and something just triggers us to start leaking out into the world. And this is usually at a life turning point. Okay. So it might be end of school, or it might be parenthood, it might be moving countries, it might be loss of a loved one, but something triggers us to be unable to keep it all together anymore. Conversely, what can happen is that we approach a sense of safety and peace. And within that safety and peace, something inside us says, well, it's okay to let go now. And so we can just fall apart. And that's actually what I believe happened to me with the physical manifestation. So when I was in my 20s, I'd come out of this horrible journey with mental health. I got a good job, I got a good house, I got engaged. And it was like, oh, there is some semblance of safety. And that's when my body began to break down. And this is a really common scenario amongst my client and sort of the community who follow my work, that they have experienced this too. It's okay,
It's almost like when people say when they go on vacation is when they get sick.
Absolutely,
it's when you finally
thing.
let your guard down for just a minute, and that's when you catch that cold. Always in Hawaii, right? So your book focuses a lot on relationship dynamics. You mentioned relational several times here, which I think is critical, is being part of the community and trauma and how it impacts the community. Can you tell us more about how relationships are connected to mental health?
Relationships are the biggest indicator of our sense of well-being or distress and discomfort. So our relationships are the biggest indicator of how our mental health is going to be. Relationships are a bit like a resource. So we need each other in order to survive and thrive, in order to co-regulate and kind of find a sense of balance and sustainability. So we need community and people. So if we don't have that, we're going to find it very hard to metabolize our experiences and to show up in peaceful and powerful ways. If we have relationships in our life that are actually disrespectful or harmful, it's going to take so much more toll on our being at every level. So relationships are key. A lot of our trauma stems from harmful relationships. And so when it comes to healing, relationships can be the crucible for healing if we engage with them with that conscious awareness and intention.
Okay, and can that also be a trigger, a relationship, obviously, for trauma? The exact opposite?
Absolutely,
right. Okay.
Absolutely. And that's a really common thing when you know, everyone has friends, and I've been this person too, who ends up in really difficult or disrespectful or harmful relationships again and again and again. And either it's that our unconscious is trying to repeat past harmful relationship dynamics, or that it's someone that we engage with becomes a trigger for all of the trauma that we're suppressing. So the relationship can be the trigger for what we were talking about, for the trauma to start coming out.
Okay. Okay, so that's a lot to unpack there when it comes to relationships, whether it's, you know, friendships or, you know, intimate relationships with loved ones, whatever that could look like. And I guess that, so can you talk a little bit more about that actually? So what would be some things that people, like, is it as simple as these are things you should look out for, or behaviors that you see, or how to spot a cycle? Like, do you have any thoughts around that for the audience or me? When it comes to just identifying relationships. Again, I'm not talking about loved ones, but it could just be people you interact with, and how to identify something that could start towards a cycle that's unhealthy.
Again, it's a really complex conversation. So to understand our relationship patterns now, we have to look back to what I call our map for love. Okay. So our early life relationships set our relational blueprint. So we learn what relationships look like, how to give love, how to receive love, how much is too much, how much is not enough. And so if we have learned in the past that love is harmful or shaming or neglectful, or demands that we shift and change ourselves, those are the kind of relationship dynamics we're going to unconsciously seek in our adult life. And so in order to start spotting signs, we need to look back to that blueprint, that map for love. And I write a lot about this in the book. We also need to understand, how am I perceiving? What are my perceptive and proprioceptive pathways? And to understand this, we need to learn about our nervous system. So in the case of trauma, what happens is that past experiences of threat internalize and remain inside us, or are triggered dynamically through relationships. And so we can often perceive threat where there is none, and we can often perceive safety where there is none. So our wires get crossed. And so to understand, when we're relating, am I experiencing what is true and current in the present, or are my perceptions coloured by the past? So it's super complicated. So in order to spot whether people are harmful or not, we need to first understand, how am I processing them?
And it seems like a book is a great place to start, but it seems like this type of work is consistent and continuous. So, you know, till the last page of the book and onwards. So what I guess is, you know, coming out of this book, someone reading it, what would you hope they'd take as a next step for themselves?
You know, in the book, each chapter provides self-inquiry questions so that you can start to think, not only while you're reading it, but after. So I hope that the book helps a lot of people who read it to become more aware about their why, and to then take steps to set a boundary with themselves and with others and say, no, I'm not going to allow all these past influences to dictate the way I perceive, express, and engage in the world. I'm going to choose to do it differently, to show up and relate in ways that heal rather than harm.
Excellent. And what about the cover of the book? I was actually interested. So I'm going off on a few tangents now, but I just think this is really interesting. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I love my cover. Yeah. I'm so happy with my cover. It took a really long time to get here. So the book is out with Penguin Random House, and so it's one of their illustrators who designed the cover. And initially, you know, when you get a book deal, you have to, at the time that you're submit a brief for the cover. So I submitted a brief for a couple of options, and the first cover they came back with, I was really unhappy with. It was quite aggressive looking, and so I was very upset.
Right. Trauma, yeah.
The cover was, I said, I don't want people to look at the book and feel traumatized or triggered. Right away, yeah, right. I want them to feel inspired and curious. And so I'm so grateful that they were very responsive. And so there was a bit of back and forth, and I guess we've landed on this beautiful cover where there are two people, and I guess we're talking a lot about relational dynamics and how we're relational creatures. And I think as well, you can see that there's kind of no clear race. You know, there's man, woman. You could probably see any race here, and also there's these layers to show how we're so layered and complex. And so I really love that the illustrator came up with this. And then you can see on the back there are all of these symbols. So I often talk about how trauma shows up in code. And most of us don't understand the language of trauma. And so I hope that this book helps people to decode their trauma and then start to respond in ways that heal. And yeah, I feel very happy with how the cover represents this.
I think it looks great.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I do. So a little bit around kind of the studying that you did, because you said, you had that light bulb moment, which I think a lot of people do when they want, when they get really passionate about something. What does that look like? Like, what does that research, what does that studying look like? You know, how do you, and there are so many different ways to study trauma, so many different practices, so many different therapies, so many different, ways of interacting. How did you decide what your path was going to be in studying, and what did those studies look like?
I was generally very intuitive, which I am in general. So the first training I did was as a hypnotherapist, and then I went on to study regression therapy. And so this is my formative training that helps me understand the unconscious and how all of those past experiences decontextualize within us and the way we're experiencing in the world. And so when I started working as a young hypnotherapist, I was really passionate about it, and wow, the mind is so powerful. But I realized very soon that, hey, what about the body? And I saw this pattern of people making these amazing mental shifts and maybe experiencing change for a while, but then things were decontextualizing. Like it would come up later in a relationship dynamic. Something would be triggered, so it wasn't sustaining. And so I realized the body needs to play an important part. I also trained as a craniosacral therapist, which is a form of osteopathy, and it's a light touch technique. And during my sort of years as a patient, I was receiving craniosacral therapy twice a week for 10 years from this beautiful physiotherapist back in Australia. And back at the time, I couldn't really understand what was going on because he would just touch me really lightly. I felt better in his presence. So I was in very severe pain. My pain would decrease, my mobility would increase, my power would increase. So my hands were in splints. I wasn't able to walk properly. And just from being gently held by this practitioner, I would feel better. And I now know that that's the power of human connection and co-regulation. But again, it didn't really take me towards healing. So I decided I'm going to train in this modality. And so I started blending hypnotherapy and craniosacral therapy together. And there was really powerful results. But what I started to notice is that when people felt really safe and when all of those barriers came down, the trauma would start to come up. So I realized I really need to learn more deeply about why this happens and how to best respond. And so then I did a lot of different trainings all over the world. So I learned about breath release, and I did more bodywork trainings, and I flew to Norway and trained with a doctor there, and I read and I read and I read and I read, and then I spent a lot of time figuring out my modality, which I use now, which is called trauma-informed relational somatics, and it blends the mind and the body, but also a relational approach. So the way that I work now and teach is to harness the power of our relationships in order to promote healing.
Can you walk me through a little bit about what like a session would look like? Obviously I can't even repeat the trauma
Trauma-informed
Thank you.
relational
Yeah,
somatics.
exactly. So clearly I need you. Can you walk through like what a session is like? So someone comes to you and they say, what does that process look like? What does the cycle of treatment look like?
Okay.
And how did you relate some of those, learnings into your book?
So it will look really different depending on the human that comes up, and so that's the whole point. It's relational, so I'm not rolling out a process or a protocol. I'm learning to listen to the unspoken, to the trauma, how it's showing up inside the body, inside the way they're relating to me, and also inside the fragmented psyche. So someone that comes in with trauma will often be only expressing from a part of themselves, and there'll be all these other internal voices and experiences going on. So I've learned to tune into what's not expressed. So I'll tune into someone and we'll allow the story to emerge. And when someone's sharing their story, it's really common for them to only share a little piece or rush over pieces that are difficult or skip or omit. So to be a great therapist, we need to be an incredible story navigator and to bring enough relational safety and attunement to make it safe to come back over the parts that are rushed over, to explore the parts that are missed, or to inquire if a part of the self is experiencing differently to how they're expressing. So usually a session will begin with me speaking with this person and learning and listening and making it safe for all of their parts to enter the room and for threat responses that will come up in the safety of the dynamic to illuminate and then fall away. Usually we'll then move to working on the table and creating an experience of safety and resonance with the body that then allows the person to tap in to the suppressed trauma. So because trauma is non-verbal, unconscious and felt, we often can't access it through just talking alone. We need to enter a state where the felt and the unconscious come into the room and can be brought into the unconscious. And here we connect our left and our right brain. So when someone's on the table, different things can happen. They might just feel super safe. They might feel emotion welling. They may have memories, which is the trauma coming up for processing, and the body may want to twitch or move, or there may be movements that want to complete and express through the body, and it will be different every time. And after we do some work on the table and process, we spend some time integrating, coming back to safety and making sense of the experience.
Wow, that sounds amazing and also intense, and I'm assuming that this is over the course of several sessions.
So the way I work, boundaries are really important. So in order for healing to happen, we have to create the conditions and dynamics to make it possible. So when I work with a client, it's a commitment to 6 sessions over 3 months as a starting point. And through that 3 months, we will build relational attunement and safety to make it safe for the trauma to lift, to begin to process. And then we continue on. And typically I would work with a client anywhere between 9 months and 2 years, depending on the complexity of the trauma. But we always recommit every 3 months. So the commitment and the boundaries are what make healing possible.
And do the same traumas come up again and again?
It depends on the person. Most people that I now work with have very complex trauma, so there's so many different things that come up. If there's been sort of a very big trauma that's really defined who that person is and how it is, it will usually process in layers for sure. And it also is really common that it's when the client has processed a lot of what's very present at the beginning. So most people arrive to therapy in crisis. Once there is a greater sense of safety and peace and life is looking a little better, that's when the deep healing work really begins. And it's interesting because most people then want to leave therapy. They think, oh, I'm done now. I'm not in crisis anymore. I'm going to go off and have my life. But I'm like, let's sit here. Let's sit here and see what healing can happen now. And that's when we shift into self-mastery.
Amazing. Amazing. I want to talk a little bit, and then, so as far as the book goes, obviously you probably even have case studies of processes that you've run and patients that you've sat with and worked with. Do you feel like a lot of that, do you get a lot of new learnings from your patients as well, or is it your process and it seems to kind of work in different ways with different complexities?
I'm learning through my patients all the time. I'm learning through my peers all the time, and I'm learning from myself all the time. So my work will continue to evolve and adapt based on everything I learn. And I think that we're meant to be that way. We're not meant to be fixed and finite.
Yep, to be stagnant, exactly. Yeah. So what about social impact? So this is something I've enjoyed, just kind of watching, whether it's your posts online or just even, in our chats that we have with the association, but social impact and giving back. So how does that relate to your work? And obviously, I think working in femtech, I think a lot of people think like women's health, that means it's social impact, when actually it's a very commercial opportunity. So how do you relate kind of, I guess, social impact, and how do you create social impact through the work that you're doing?
I believe our own healing is the road to the social impact that we crave. So when we are able to bring all of our unconscious into the room and into our awareness, and when we can check our bias, and when we can start showing up in ways that heal rather than harm, and create an experience of compassion and belonging, we are creating social impact. So when we heal our trauma, we change the world. And so I believe that every single person that is making a commitment to their own healing is co-creating a kinder world.
Okay. And then when it comes to trauma, like what you're saying, how does one know if one has trauma? I guarantee a lot of us do, but how does one know to take the journey to start thinking about it from a trauma perspective versus just like, oh, it was a bad day, or I didn't like that part of growing up, or what, reflecting on it, like how do you kind of identify what is trauma and what this type of work, like when you should be doing this type of work as an individual? Because this is not familiar to me, so this is, how would I know to apply it?
I think if we are experiencing a sense of threat or exclusion, or feeling like we don't belong in this world, it's an indication that there's probably something to explore. Whether we want to label it trauma or not doesn't matter. But a really common experience for many people is to feel like, I don't fit here. And so some people might feel like they've been born into the wrong body, into the wrong family, into the wrong country or race or era. And this is one of the core markers that suggests we haven't had those three ingredients of safety, belonging, and the ability to share authentically. And so if we feel like something's wrong in our world and we don't belong here, it's an indication that exploring could be really helpful.
All right, that helps. Thank you for that. And this kind of, you just lead me into my next question. I love it. Diversity, equality, inclusion, everything in the D&I space is obviously becoming more and more important, and thankfully so. So can you talk a little bit about your take, outside of what you just described a little bit, but a bit more maybe looking at it from the corporate environment versus the individual as well, would be really interesting to hear.
So the DEI movement has arisen because people are feeling a sense of exclusion and inequity, and like they're not truly welcome. And so the DEI movement is trying to remedy that. I don't think we can really have a conversation about DEI without looking at trauma, because belonging is one of those key components that relates to trauma. If we are holding unresolved trauma, it's going to stop us from feeling like we belong, and it's also going to continue to cause us to move with bias and to keep judging and shaming others. So if we really want to move the needle in this conversation, I think we need to bring trauma into the mix. Something that's very interesting that I see with this movement is there's a lot of asking others to shift their expression so as not to trigger us. And so this actually takes us towards a relational dynamic or a culture where everybody's hypervigilant. Oh, I better not say the wrong thing because I'm going to trigger that person. Or, hey, don't speak to me like that. You're triggering me. You need to shift. And when we create a culture of hypervigilance and we keep asking ourselves to twist into pretzels so as not to upset anybody, we actually perpetuate the same cycle where we are not belonging and where we are shape-shifting, where we're not able to show up as our authentic self. So I think something that's really very important is for us to bring trauma work to the mainstream. So rather than try and avoid triggers, what I would love to see is that we bring very gentle awareness to our triggers. and explore the story. Because it's when we create safe dynamics and communities that we can explore the triggers and where they come from and what's been lacking. That's when healing happens, not when we sort of stand back and become super hyper vigilant. So I really think that if we want to take DEI forward in a way that promotes transformation, we've got to bring trauma work into it.
And how do we have more people open to the concept? Because I'm assuming that a lot of people, even talking about like hypervigilance, I think maybe it's even just, different communities are more impacted and oppressed, for your word earlier. So it's a lot easier for me, in a world of privilege to say, sitting here at, in a gorgeous club, in a gorgeous city with everything I could want, so it's a lot easier for me to be like, oh, let's all talk about trauma, whereas someone else who has grown up a very different way, well, it's just a whole different journey. So how do you reconcile those two, and say, how does everyone buy into this process?
Not everybody can buy into this process, and that is a sad truth. And it's something that we all need to grieve again and again and again. We can only truly begin to heal when the dynamics and conditions are available. And we can't create them on our own. We have to create it within relationships and communities. So if that's not available, it's going to be very, very hard to heal. And when that happens, if we are living in a culture, a relationship, a system that doesn't promote our healing and our well-being, it's very, very hard. And a lot of people can't even make the decision to leave those dynamics or systems because the alternative would be even more dangerous than to stay within them. And so when this happens, actually what we need to promote is awareness, working with our own personal boundaries and trying to access agency and choice as often as possible. But the sad truth is healing isn't available to everyone. I don't want to sugarcoat it.
And so there's the individual saying, I'm choosing to heal for myself and manage my own trauma or confront my own trauma, maybe a better word. What about helping others? How does one help others towards their journey?
Becoming aware and compassionate of somebody else's trauma and their why is the first step. Not joining them in it is the second step. So this is all about compassionate boundaries. So we can understand and empathize that perhaps the way someone is engaging or expressing in ways that are unkind or disrespectful or harmful derives from their trauma. And if we were to join them in it, we would react. And so then we actually end up creating the cycle again and again. But what we can do is understand, acknowledge, and learn how to create compassionate boundaries where we say, I see you and I hear you, but I don't join you in your reality. And the more empowered we are to do this, that's how we become the humans that break the cycle. And it's often when you hold up this very compassionate boundary that the person can actually start to see and feel what's happening inside them in a real way. And that's when healing can actually begin to happen. When we don't hold up a boundary and we join someone in their trauma or their chaos, they can't see it and it continues. And I think that it's a very fine art to be able to hold up these boundaries in ways that promote healing.
And the last part of the book is called, I keep saying and before every question, I'm not sure. I think it's because I feel like we're continuing to talk. The last part of the book is called The Laws of Peace and Power. Can you tell us about these laws, where they come from, why, what they mean to you, etc.?
Sure.
Thank you.
So the laws of peace and power is the code that I try to live by to continue to create a sense of internal peace and relational harmony in my life. I don't always live by them. I slip out, and usually there's a consequence when I do, but I'm quite good at noticing it, trying to process and understand why that happened and to grow and to come back to them. Once we've done our core healing work, so once we've brought all of the unconscious matter into conscious awareness, we reach what I call the point of freedom. And this is where we become the conscious co-creators of our life and the lives around us. And this is when we can choose to live by these laws. So This is my beautiful bookmark that has the laws on them. So the laws are 1, reclaiming sovereignty; 2, capacity and personal sustainability; 3, complete accountability; 4, receptivity; 5, purity of power; and 6 is reverence. And I believe that when we adopt the laws of peace and power as a code for living and relating, we will break the cycle of trauma, and we will be able to show up in ways that are peaceful, powerful, sustainable, and collaborative.
Oh, amazing, amazing. I think so. Oh gosh, there's so much. Well, first of all, I should look out here. I should look out here and ask if anyone has any questions in the immediate that we welcome.
Hi.
Is there a way to, obviously all of us have a lot of experiences which we don't like.
Mm-hmm.
It may be traumatic or not, depending on that person's perception and response to it. And of course, some people's threshold may be very high and takes a very traumatic events like murder or violence to trigger it, to be traumatic for it. Another person may be, I see a sick person and it's traumatic. I see a dying person or death. That's for Siddhartha. He's special. Okay, and then for normal people like us, is there a way that we can instantly let go everything of all traumas to have a space, to create a distance, so that we can see from whether it's emotional distance or physical distance or whatever, spiritual distance. And then that means we have a dichotomy. We have a self that is hurt, another self that sees from a distance, dispassionate, and yet can respond in a way that is different. When we were young, we were innocent, ignorant, don't know how to respond inappropriately. Now that we are adult, old enough, we have more skills. Can we have the dispassionate self that with the more skills respond differently and in a way that can bring up the child that was hurt to be a discerning adult, to be able to respond appropriately? Can we do that? How do we do that?
I believe we can do that. This is what healing is, but I don't believe it's instant. I think it takes years and years, and anyone that's offering some instant way to become a fully healed human is serving you some kind of Kool-Aid. When we have trauma, the way we experience in the world is coloured and tainted by it. So in order to do what you're suggesting, which is to respond in this neutral way, we need to be able to empty out a lot of the experiences and emotions that have been suppressed. So when we are triggered or reacting, what's actually happening is that a current stimulus, experience, or person is triggering our suppressed trauma or bias into expression. And so when we do our healing work, we actually begin to empty out and purify all of those experiences from us so that we can respond differently. And so we get to a point where we may be triggered, but we have enough capacity to contain our trigger, to check ourselves and respond differently. And this comes from a lot of healing work, a lot of self-inquiry, a lot of healing and mastering our nervous system, and learning to exist here differently. But I do believe it's possible, and I think this is what I hope that the book supports people to do. But it's a long-term job.
I personally believe, it's an opinion, that we cannot empty out, because these experiences is really etched into our psyche.
Yes.
It's really imprinted, and we cannot remove the imprint. What we can do is only reinterpret it, so that instead of the old emotion it triggers, we can reinterpret it, that we can have new emotions to replace the old emotions.
Okay.
Just like, certain computers you can just delete the memory, but we humans cannot delete memory. We can only replace it with different emotions to the old male-adjusted emotions. How do we do that to have a new way of more adaptive emotions to replace those old male adaptive emotions that make us what we are now.
Yeah.
Because we may be replacing it with even worse emotions,
Okay.
even more male adaptive.
Mm-hmm.
For example, like Hitler, he was great in bringing Germany up, I mean, from oppression by those victorious nations, those unreasonable war reparations, so that the whole Germanic peoples were felt oppressed, and suddenly a savior come up. I mean, he was good to his mother, loved his mother, but he has grievances, real or imagined, against the Jews. That's why he created so much Holocaust and suffering. But he did what many people did, like Alexander the Great conquered other peoples, those Genghis Khan or whatever, those mighty powers that went around conquering. I mean, he did very bad things like Holocaust, which is different from other people. But in other ways, he's like others, whether it's benevolent or not, conquering other people. I mean, in that sense, he's still the same with other good peoples.
Thanks for sharing.
How do we replace it with new emotions, new mind, new ways that is better and good and adaptive and not even worse?
Yeah.
How do we do that?
I mean, it's very complex, and I hope that my book helps a lot of people to do that slowly over time. So I cannot give you an answer like this, and I don't think that anybody could do that. I agree that we cannot erase the past, so that blueprint is there, but what we can do is slowly begin to rewrite the code. And in order to do that, we have to heal our nervous system. We have to learn about how the past is influencing us in the present. And I believe we do need to discharge a lot of threat and a lot of suppressed emotions. And part 4 of the book speaks about the unconscious emotions of trauma that many of us hold. So I hope that that's helpful, and you'll have to read the book to learn more. Yeah.
I have a question. I totally believe in mental, like therapy and all that, but when you see someone who's going through a hard time, let's say if they're your parents or your loved one, and they don't believe in it, how do you help them get on that path?
It's really hard. We cannot force anybody into their healing, and sometimes when we try and force someone to explore something that they're not ready for, they're going to repel further into their own chaos. And there's also going to be a rupture in our relationship. What we can do is work on our own embodiment and show up as the example for how we can live in ways that heal rather than harm. In the end, there's choices, isn't there? So we have to accept people for who we are. And either that means we accept them and we continue to engage with them, or we start to draw different boundaries around the way we engage with them. So again, not joining them in their chaos and in that cycle of reactivity. And in some cases, we choose to leave. And I think to do that brings up so much grief. And it forces us to feel our own aloneness. And many of us would rather stay in dysfunctional dynamics than to leave and to actually sit with our own pain. And in the book, again in part 4, I talk about the wound of aloneness. And I think this is the wound that many of us are running from, and what keeps us in dysfunctional relationships and also engaging in experiences that really don't serve us. Does that answer?
Because it's just a bit overwhelming. There's so many options to how to get support and how to get help. Even within a clinical psychology framework, there's EMDR, there's so many different types of things. And so some of the things you mentioned today about other types of therapy that I actually haven't heard of. So my question is a bit more about how do you know what's right for you, and how, and even within that, I imagine it's not linear. So how do you, plan your journey on this process? And also, everything's quite expensive to access. So what's the way to do this?
Thanks for that question. When working with a therapist or a practitioner, the most important thing is that you feel safe with them. And I believe that that is the therapy. And the modality that that practitioner or therapist is using is secondary. So it's about, do I feel safe? Do I feel heard? And do I feel like I'm not hiding parts of myself? So that's a really common thing to happen in the therapy room, is that people show up and perform for their therapist. And that's a trauma response in itself. And if we have a tendency to do that, does my therapist catch that? Do they catch that I'm not being authentic or that I'm hiding? And if we can find people like that who can hear and tune into the unsaid, that's when we know healing is beginning to happen. So I think it's less about the modality and more about the human. I also think that sometimes in a safe dynamic, all of our stuff will come up. And in the therapy room, this is called transference. So a really good therapist is going to catch when we bring our dysfunctional relationship dynamics into the room and work with it. But I guess the simple answer is choose a human that you feel safe with, and the rest should follow. Talking about the non-linear process, the people that can best serve us will change over time. As we continue to change, we may find that we need somebody else with different qualities that can help us at the next leg of our journey. The last piece is healing happens outside the treatment room. So the treatment room or time with a therapy, it's like an experimental safe space where we can learn new ways of expressing and relating. True healing happens in daily life. So when we're engaging in therapy, we want to understand, well, is my life beginning to change in small ways? And if it is, then it's an indication that the process is working.
No quick fix, right?
No quick fix. No quick fix.
Well, the last question, do we have any? I'm so sorry.
One more.
I'm sorry.
I was going to just follow that question about individual healing with maybe community and global healing. Natalia, you're on this journey from working one-on-one to now publishing a book which reaches a great audience. And going back to that discussion about DEI, trauma, hypervigilance, these ideas make a great deal of sense. In practice, what might that look like? For example, Lisa, right? You mentioned privilege. The people that are traumatized are not the ones with the resources, the money, the time, or even the knowledge that this kind of healing exists. And so when we encounter, whether in a corporate or a social setting, somebody who is triggered by things we say, what I'm hearing is that the solution isn't for me to censor myself and not say things that might trigger them. But at the same time, on whom is the onus? Like, what is the next step? Do I tell that person now, go heal your trauma, I'm not going to engage with it? Or is it like you mentioned, what we need to exhibit is compassion. What does that compassion look like? What might a community program look like, or what might a corporate program look like if we want to bring about healing and avoid that hypervigilant state, which is not helpful?
Thank you. The answer to this is going to depend on the dynamics of each community, the boundaries and the safety for exploration. So our boundaries are responsive, they're not fixed and finite. If we are putting in fixed and finite boundaries, they're not responsive, they're defenses, they're not boundaries at all. So boundaries are born from safety and responsiveness. And so in order to create that, we have to create an environment where people feel safe to show up, and then we have to find where is the appropriate boundary. Our boundaries will also depend on what our role within any dynamic, whether it's singular or more complex, is. So am I a leader here? Am I a peer here? Or is the other person a peer here? So this comes down to the question of position of power. And this is something that I teach on. So the way we set our boundaries should depend on our position and our internal resource or power. So it's a really complex conversation. But absolutely, we don't want to show up and say, yeah, sure, leak your trauma all over me, that's fine, and I'm going to be quiet and not say anything at all. And that actually happens more and more. I'm going to let you have a fit because of all your past stuff. Actually, no. So it's a bit like working with our kids, right? If our kid's having a tantrum, we say, I hear you, I see you, it's okay to have those emotions, but it's not okay to express like this. It's the same. in a corporate program, the people that I work with really want this. They're opting in. So that choice and intention is really important. And this works not for everybody. So it's not a box ticking exercise at all. We create the safe space. We talk about our trauma. We talk about our bias. We talk about the themes that are decontextualizing. We learn to listen to our nervous systems. We connect to themes. And we explore how we are triggered in the moment. So something that's common in all of my trainings is people get triggered. And that's because the space is so safe. And so when someone's triggered, my job as the facilitator and the lead is to bring that into the room and to create an environment where we can all explore and respond. Then we have greater self-awareness. We also develop greater empathy. So it's definitely a process. Does that answer?
Thank you. Yeah. And
Thanks.
concretely, like if people in the room are working that space, what can they do next step? And it sounds like certainly reading the book and engaging in a corporate training would be helpful.
Yes.
Which I will say, how can the audience and I learn more about you, and how can we get our hands on the book?
Well, you can purchase a copy of the book
There
today,
we go.
and my amazing team member Viv there in the green jacket can help you when we finish. Or you can order through my website or Amazon as well. LinkedIn's a great place to connect with me. I'm really active. I post nearly every day, but you can also find me through my website or through my team at Illuma Health.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much. I think I learned a lot about listening today, having empathy, and making sure we invite others to belong and to be part of the community, because it sounds like that's, the first stage of healing is just being open to other people. So a big thank you for everything you have to say. I feel like this conversation, we're just getting started, and I need a table to lay on so you can tell me more and give me some therapy. Thank you so much. So I really, really appreciate it. And thank you guys all for joining us as well. And again, thank you 1880 for hosting us today. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely fun.